All right, well, it's 12 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Montana Institute on Ecosystems weekly seminar series, The Rough Cut. This fall, we are highlighting the important topics of climate change and its impacts, so please be sure to check the calendar for upcoming talks in the Rough Cut series, which includes next week's talk by Dr. Jennifer Robum and Dr. Haley Blackburn on mental health challenges associated with climate change and climate-related work. We have room on the Rough Cut schedule in December and going into spring term for you, your colleagues, and your students to deliver seminars, so please contact me for more information. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Montana Institute on Ecosystems Interim Director, Dr. Julia Haggerty, who will speak on Montana ranches as high net worth property, emerging land ownership trends, and their implications. As well as working for the IOE, Dr. Haggerty is an associate professor of geography in the Department of Earth Sciences. The work discussed in this talk was supported by a recent grant from the National Science Foundation to update and expand upon research on 1990s era trends, land ownership change in the Greater Yellowstone. As a PhD student at the University of Colorado Boulder, Haggerty contributed to the first Greater Yellowstone ecosystem study, led by Dr. William Travis and Dr. Hannah Gosnell. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. We encourage you to keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation and to join in for questions and answers when Julia has finished. I'll keep track of questions in the chat, and you can also use the raise hand function or unmute yourself. And with that being said, Julia, I'll let you go ahead and get started.
Great, thanks, Paige. I'm super excited to be here. I see some familiar faces in the little box I can see. Thank you for making time for this. This work is just such a pleasure to work on, and it is really benefits from some amazing collaborators who you see here. So we're sharing findings from the research project that Paige described, and it's about this subject of ranches, which this audience is no doubt familiar with, and this audience knows that ranches play a really critical role in the ecological and social function of large landscapes in Montana. These large landscapes in turn play a critical role in global biodiversity in many ways. And also ranches are fundamental economic assets at the local, national, and even global scale. So our work starts with the assumption that what happens to ranches as they are bought and sold and undergo changes in land use is a critical issue at the nexus of human environment systems. And we're grateful that we've had support most recently from the NSF and then previously from a number of organizations, not least of which was Mike Clark's Yellowstone Heritage, which contributed to the first set of work. So we're able to build on that previous set of work. And our current project, which we call Rangelands 2.0, in reference to our original study, explores recent trends in ranch ownership with a primary orientation to understanding how markets and ranch management have evolved in the decade and a half since my colleagues and I documented what we now call the amenity turn in ranch ownership in the 1990s. But before we start, it's really important to acknowledge Montana's settler colonial history. The land we're going to talk about has only been privatized for less than 2 centuries. Native cultures persist in Montana and many thrive, but the violent expropriation of this land is a really important, persistent trauma to recognize, and it's the subject of important work here at MSU and by coalitions like landgrabu.org, which I urge you to explore. So today I want to talk about work that is not on wildlife and management issues, land management issues, which we've developed in other papers, but primarily focus on 2 papers that look at the dynamics of buying and selling property and the implications of those dynamics. So in this work, we're asking about dominant patterns of land ownership change following the amenity turn, what drivers and enablers of those patterns are, and then thinking a little bit about implications for rural economies. So to walk you through that today, I'm going to provide just a quick orientation to where we were after we looked at the 90s, tell you a little bit about our methods, and then I'll describe in detail the patterns of ownership change that we've studied and some of the drivers and enablers. And then I by that point, I think I will have run out of time, and we'll have to have a discussion about what the implications are for rural economies, and I'll be excited to hear your thoughts on that. So the article you see referenced here provides a starting point for this work, studying 10 counties adjoining Greater Yellowstone in Montana and Wyoming, led by Dr. Hannah Gosnell. We documented rates and volumes of sales of large ranches in the 1990s. And large ranches referred to any private holdings of 400 acres or more. In this work, we also characterized who was buying the properties according to typology that distinguished buyers on an axis that was both included occupational as well as value attributes. And it's important to note that this work was really the first work to do this. There's no consistent measures of land ownership that are available to the public. In many Western states are non-disclosure states, meaning that they don't publish any transactional data about real estate purchases. And those states that do publish transaction data typically don't aggregate and analyze that at the detail that responds to the kinds of questions that we're interested in. So work that Hannah and Bill Travis undertook really pioneered the method for combining tax roll data and data purchased from private appraisers, so real estate professionals, to document these changes in ownership. And in that study, we found that during the period 1990 to 2001, 1 in 5 acres in private large ranch land in the region changed hands, and that non-traditional buyers, amenity owners, and investors were outcompeting full-time and part-time working ranchers as buyers. And the rates varied across counties, but in general, with high amenity areas, we were seeing, this turn to amenity purchasing of properties. So in our 2.0 study, we've carried forward our interest in these dynamics and their implications for land management, but we've added to that a more explicit focus on the economic context in which this is occurring. And so in our work, we've operationalized a practice of what social scientists call studying up, and that means paying close attention to the structural forces that enable and perpetuate the kind of ownership patterns we're interested in. And so in this spirit, we've really worked to rename this ranch ownership phenomenon as where the wealthy are owning ranches as just that. So we use the term high net worth individual to describe buyers and the property regimes that they're building. And it might seem quaint at this day and age that the definition of a high net worth individual is someone who has $1 million in disposable assets. In an age where people are paying cash for properties that cost tens of millions of dollars, this is possibly not the best distinction. And you'll note in the chart on the left of the screen that during the time span covered by our research, the total wealth of US billionaires has grown in inflation-adjusted dollars from $240 billion in 1990 to $4.2 trillion in March of 2021. And that's about 600 people today who control that wealth. So from 5% to 20% of GDP is controlled by billionaires. So these are important figures in our landscape. Our findings draw on a mixed method approach that involves really 3 tactics. The first thing we need to do in order to understand the landscape is work with land ownership data from publicly available records. And this is no small task. We have a 25-page appendix to our paper on this because you need to extensively clean and manipulate the tax roll data to create meaningful ownership information. Secondly, we depend on the cooperation of private appraisers to share or sell us data on ranch sales. So as I said, these are not publicly available in Montana. And in some cases, those sales data sets have useful qualitative information as well as the date and size and buyer and seller of properties. In addition, this work really builds heavily on qualitative data collected in interviews and focus groups. There's been a much larger interviewing project associated with this work, but in the papers that we're reporting on here, we'll be talking about focus groups with ranch real estate professionals and 24 key informant interviews related to that. So I'll turn right away to our findings about ownership change. Our first question focuses on the pattern, particularly in comparison to those high rates of turnover and the dominance of amenity buyers documented in the 1990s study. And we use data on ranch sales and comparative spatial data on patterns of land concentration to ask what patterns we're seeing. And our results point to two dominant trajectories of ranch buying and selling. The first is what we are calling the amenity churn, and that is the idea that the buying and selling of ranch properties is a routine occurrence, and more specifically, that in high amenity areas, ranch ownership is likely to transition on a regular basis. And this is somewhat in contrast to the relatively stable multi-generational ranch ownership patterns that have historically been associated with production-oriented ranching. And then a second pattern that really has a striking imprint, became much clearer in the second round of work, is the concentration of land in this broader amenity market. So there are buyers who are acquiring multiple properties and assembling them into very large operations, building, in the words of one of our realtor informants, literal empires. So our first data point is this chart on the number and scale of ranch sales over time. What we're doing here is putting two data sets side by side. So we're looking at 6 Greater Yellowstone, Montana counties. These are all the counties that border the Greater Yellowstone except Gallatin County. And we have sales from the 1990s. We have a big gap where we just can't get data for a middle period from 2001 through 2004. And then we have our newer data set. And so recall that this earlier period on the left here is a period that stood out for the pace of activity. But when you come to the more recent period, you see that that activity really continued. You can see a dip in the global financial crisis, but that sales activity has nonetheless tracked or exceeded activity in the 90s, where an average in these counties of 29 ranch properties sold a year. In the period from 2005 to 2018, the average has been 28. So pretty similar rates of turnover. And then secondly, we really see the amenity churn when we take a careful look at our data sets. And what we did was take the sales data that we had from the 1990s and look at each of those properties and then do a multi-step process to find out if that property was still in the hands of the person that purchased it in the 1990s. So we're looking at, once a property changes hands, is it likely to change hands again? And here you see evidence from one county, Park County, that's our neighbor just to the east, where of the 60 unique sales recorded in our database from 1990 to 2001, about a third remain in the buyer's hands from the 1990s. Others have since resold, sometimes more than once. And generally speaking, if we extend these trends out across the other counties in the Montana portion of the Greater Yellowstone, we can see that this general pattern of turnover continues. So looking at, we had to drop one of our counties out because the data just didn't really, didn't have good data for Carbon County, that's the Red Lodge area. But for these 5 counties, if you look at the red part of these bar charts, those are properties that sold in the 1990s and then have since resold. So a substantial portion. We're able from this data set to calculate a hold period. So an average tenure of the owners of these properties in this data set, owners that have come on the landscape since 1990. The average hold is about 16 years with a median of close to 20 years. And those of you who are real estate professionals on the phone will say, well, of course, we've been telling you that forever, that the average hold time of these amenity properties is about 20 years. So I'm going to pause here and add what we're calling a COVID coda. I didn't mention that in our realtor interviews, we went back and did some member checking, which is just a process of running through your results with some expert key informants. And we did that in spring of 2021, and that allowed us to ask some interview questions about the COVID period, which, you know, our data only go to 2018. So we got some qualitative data about what's been happening. And what I would tell you is that what we hear from the professionals is what you've also seen in the paper. The trends that we're documenting of turnover really have probably only accelerated to the extent that there's been inventory available. So here's a quote from one of our interviews. ever since about June of 2020, the industry has been just nuts, just as you would expect. This professional says we've been in business a long time, and last year exceeded any volume of annual business we've done in our history by 25 or 30%, and almost all of it occurred in the first half of the year. So the COVID real estate boom that we're familiar with, if you're dialing in from Bozeman, plays out in these large properties as well. And here's a quotation from this, a different informant in the same round of interviews, talking about the degree to which the demand for these properties is something epiphenomenal or something that is more persistent. And this respondent said, even before the pandemic, it felt like something was happening with this market that wasn't going to get shut off, meaning this might not necessarily be subject to the same boom bust cycles we've seen before. It was pressing and pressing, the pressure in this market, and the pandemic just exponentiated that. I'm not sure what's going to be what'll happen. It's interesting to see how this will manifest itself, but for now, it's crazy making. So those are the data that we have to talk about the churn. And then I want to turn your attention now to thinking about concentration. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to elaborate on our methods here, but one of the things we've been really interested in is just asking, in addition to buying and selling, what's happening to the size of large properties. And so in this publication, we're just focused on dynamics of concentration, and we're reporting on these 12 counties that you can see here. So going all the way from the northern edge of the CMR region in Phillips County, all the way down to Beaverhead County in southwestern Montana. We've tracked the amount of ownership held by large landowners in 2005 and 2018. And what we report here is a concentration ratio. The concentration ratio is something that comes out of the business world, and it's used to assess the degree to which certain markets might be monopolized. And this has been adapted by colleagues of ours to look at concentration of agricultural properties. They use this to look at the sort of financialization of agricultural land in Alberta, and we borrow it here. So we're saying how much land is held by the 4 largest landowners in each county. And you can see that that concentration ratio has increased in each of these counties, with one exception in Marr County over this period of time. And another way to look at this is to use the lens of land inequality. So borrowing here from conventions in inequality research, we're just asking about the first and second largest owners. So here's a chart that shows you the second largest landowner in blue and the largest landowner in each county represented by the size of their properties. And then we can compare that to 2018. And what we see is, in some cases, a really dramatic rise in the gap between the second largest landowner and the largest landowner in each county. So on average, the size gap between the first and second largest land holding quintupled between 2005 and 2018. And in some counties, the largest land holdings doubled in size. So all of these data are to suggest that we find evidence of consistent turnover of properties in the amenity market, and we see evidence of land concentration among the owners of the largest properties. So I'll turn now to asking what drives some of these patterns of churn and concentration. And here we'll draw on data from ranch sales, from their descriptions in our database, and also from the interviews with realtors and appraisers. And when we offer for you some explanations and analysis about what's happening, an idea to keep in mind is that it's just about impossible to separate financial and what we call sort of psychodynamic motivations and orientations when it comes to ranch buying and selling. And again, our observations are primarily based on the period 2005 to 2018, although we'll again offer some of our COVID coda observations. So just to talk about the financial side of it first, an important observation that is fundamental to thinking about this is the fact that these large ranch properties in Montana are an appealing asset class for a number of reasons. These are counter-cyclical assets, and that, hard assets have been particularly in demand since the global financial crisis. There is relative ease of property acquisition and transfer in the United States. There's tremendous opportunities to defer taxes. And then in Montana, there is a very fixed supply of this particular resource in fast-growing demand. And so that creates an opportunity to earn a profit. And here's a quotation from an interview in which a real estate professional offers, in any 7-year period, Montana land can make money. You can buy a place, play rancher, make mistakes, and still make money when you sell your ranch. You can make a shit ton of money being stupid. Montana in this way is better than the stock market. And then I want to just shift quickly to saying that, as I said, it's really hard to separate out these financial drivers of ranch buying and selling from the social drivers. And so the first place we want to emphasize this overlap between the investment value and the social cultural drivers is in bringing to your attention the idea that ranches reflect qualities of what are known as Veblen goods. So Veblen goods, this is an idea that comes from the sociologist Thomas Veblen, who was writing about kind of the Gilded Age. And he observed that luxury goods, sometimes the demand actually increases with price. And that's kind of counterintuitive to theories of rational choice. So in this mode, the more expensive the ranch, the greater its perceived value and appeal. And so as a Veblen good, the acquisition of a ranch becomes a marker of social status and a source of distinction among the very rich. It's a marker between what some scholars have called the haves and the have-yots. The bigger, the more expensive, the more exclusive the property, the greater its social status. And this is just one entry point into a conversation about kind of the psychosocial dynamics that are working to drive ranch buying and selling by the very rich. So we want to emphasize also the ways that that have surfaced in our data about how ranch owners are making meaning through buying and selling properties. So we know that these properties, in addition to being good investments and being kind of status symbols, provide a variety of other kind of social benefits to individuals. So properties can be about tapping into a sense of cultural heritage, preserving family history. Other owners approach ranch ownership as a type of social enterprise or philanthropic experiment, and they use their management practices to manifest a personal ethos or a value about the world and its connection to nature. And I should say these are not always separate categories. These are often overlapping categories. At the same time, for other owners, owning a ranch provides opportunities to engage in elite and exclusive recreational opportunities. So here, this is a personal odyssey involving the pursuit of blue ribbon trout fishing or the chance to hunt a trophy bull elk, or even to prove one's business prowess by making a large ranch property earn a profit. So we report on these particular management priorities in a publication led by Katie Epstein in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers. And we'll just use this image here of Odysseus's epic to remind us also that these journeys and these psychosocial meanings are really highly individualized. And the individualistic nature of this is not trivial. And that's because the scale of the properties that we're talking about, tens of thousands of acres, and their location in ecologically significant areas gives individuals and the meaning making and the life course they bring to this property ownership a hugely outsized influence on local ecological, social, and economic systems. So how did these qualities relate to these trajectories of churn and concentration? From our interviews, there were really two dominant expressions of this interaction that emerged. They feature investment on the one hand and status and personal discovery on the other. So we'll introduce you now to these two themes that we think bring together what buyers are bringing to buying and selling and how it connects to the patterns on the landscape we see. So one revolves around a concept we call gravity, and the other returns to this idea of an empire. So gravity properties are surfaced in our interviews in the case that for a portion of high net worth owners, buying a ranch reflects a set of personal priorities at a particular moment in an individual or family's life stage. So as this quotation suggests, owners and their families seek out ranch properties as a method of pulling together a gravitational force, people or recreational opportunities. So realtors call this the gravity effect of a property. And because these properties appreciate relatively effectively, these recreational retreats are also sought after as sound investments. The gravity dimension of ranch property is reflected in spatial pattern. These are typically single properties with very high amenities. They can have excellent fishing, beautiful riparian habitat, and they're often co-located in areas with other amenities. So the Madison Valley would be a classic site for these. And importantly, these properties may or may not be in particularly excellent ranching landscapes in conventional terms, but because the psychosocial pull of a gravity property may be more about family and recreation than agricultural production, this puts a value in these kinds of landscapes. And these properties are typically not expected to turn any kind of an annual profit. Instead, the investment return is realized at the time of scale. And these are the qualities that really drive this trajectory of the amenity churn. So a family might own a ranch, a gravity property for 5 years. They might own it for 65. But what we see is that inevitably the ranch loses its gravitational pull. And that's either because it's no longer interesting to the owners or to the owner's family. Perhaps it's been replaced by another recreational pursuit. And the fundamental issue that all large properties struggle to stay in family hands at the time of transition, and that's no different here. So again, unlike multi-generational livestock ownership of the past, we should really expect to see these properties continue to change hands at least every generation, if not more often. So I'm going to segue here to a COVID commentary or a COVID coda. So here's a quotation that really expands our thinking about some of the drivers that made particularly, that add a new dimension to the notion of gravity. And that's the idea of a retreat from things that are happening in other places. And this became, really pronounced according to our realtor informants during the context of the pandemic. So here's a pretty telling quotation. What's happened last year, this is a realtor reflecting on their engagement with buyers, people seeking properties. With COVID and all of the political conflict that went on last year in major metropolitan areas, all of those things, it's completely reset people's mentality. So I'll paraphrase. In this context, the informant was talking about the idea that we had celebrated connectivity in the pandemic, put this high emphasis, really put that connectivity into question. And so the informant continues, the shift has occurred where people really value escape and privacy and boundaries and all of those things. And people who can afford them value that, and they turned into some of the most enthusiastic buyers during the pandemic panic, if you will, for rural property. So moving from gravity properties to this phenomenon of empires, for a certain set of high net worth owners, buying a ranch is really an opportunity to build a large empire. And unlike gravity properties, these ranches tend to have a more clear profit expectation. They may be more likely to take on what looks like a corporate ownership structure. And here, scale is really a key feature of empire because owners are really going to make a return on their properties in terms of their operation by assembling multiple properties together. They might agglomerate nearby properties, and often these owners are assembling networks of ranch properties across state or even national boundaries. And these empires sometimes will feature vertical integration schemes that create end markets for products on their properties. From the more personal side, we see that empires can serve as an investment with meaning making and recreational opportunities. Some call this the trout dividend, but more unique to empires is the role of personal legacy. So as this quotation alludes to, the types of buyers building empires are interested in manifesting a personal ethos about land management. They have an affinity towards land, or as our interview participants sometimes note, these are the resource the resource guys. So perhaps no owner signifies this better than media mogul Ted Turner, America's second largest landowner, who owns over 2 million acres of land worldwide, all of which he aims to manage according to his own conservation ethic. This is a philosophy that's really beautifully documented in Todd Wilkinson's book. So from a turnover standpoint, it's important to note that while empires may also change hands, the scale of them and the extent of the wealth held by their owners makes the trajectory of this ranch land ownership dynamic highly, highly consequential, not only for conservationists, but for other stakeholders. So there's really an open question if you speak to experts about whether or not empires will churn or whether they'll evolve into something different, like private conservation estates, or some of the phenomena we're seeing in southwestern Montana is the attempt to kind of institutionalize these large properties as sort of quasi-private public entities. So I'm going to shift now to sort of summarizing some of our analysis. Among these different scales and styles of operation, our sales data and the interview data we've collected point toward a couple of common influences. So if we're asking what makes ranch properties turn over in this high net worth property regime, there are a few common features that are persistent across all these ownership types. And the first is just the owner's life course. And we've gotten really interested in life course theory and sociology and write about it in one of our papers. So owners who are acquiring properties have reached a point in their financial, professional, and personal lives when it makes sense to acquire a ranch. And for the baby boomers who historically dominated the amenity turn until recently, that point was kind of midlife. And at the same time, life course is going to shape your exit from ranch ownership. So in some cases, the time to sell occurs when the owner has fulfilled their vision for the property, they've completed their hero's journey, as we said earlier, they find themselves in search of new adventures, but also when the owner can no longer easily travel to the property for health reasons is often a common time to sell. Divorce can be another reason that these ownership owners will sell their properties. And then intergenerational succession is not necessarily any easier in this cohort than it is for traditional ranch operators. This is a persistent feature across all agricultural land ownership types. And while intergenerational succession is kind of a marker and status symbol for working ranches, it's not clear that there's the same kind of cultural priority on multi-generational high net worth ownership of properties. And then, of course, every one of these land investors has a unique portfolio of investments that is going to respond to market signals in particular ways. So buying and selling, of course, is going to respond to market signals and then respond to dynamics with individuals' holdings. So taken together, we're reading all of this evidence to mean a few important things, especially from the perspective of the effects on the local and regional economy, which is really where we've dialed our energy in this recent analysis. So in a high net worth property regime, ranch ownership change should be understood to be a routine event. One would say even somewhat predictable. And at the same time, we want to recognize that turnover can be extremely consequential given the size of properties and the scale of capital involved in their management. So in the paper that we're developing from this work, our goal is to kind of come back to earth and ask what this means for rural economies. And so I offered that this would be kind of our point of discussion here. So just two last slides. So it's really tempting to get caught up in kind of the phenomenological, like celebrity status of these buyers. But I think one of the best things our work can do is help stakeholders, residents of Montana, imagine what the future of the economy might look like. So I'm just going to summarize, in the interest of time and starting discussion, some of the top line ideas we're developing. And, if our discussion takes us there, hopefully we can talk about them. So from a local livelihood standpoint, what do people do to support themselves in areas that are dominated by high net worth property regimes? Those resident owner operators who focus on livestock and who own large properties and have very little debt are likely secure, but they're always going to face challenges with transition. And these challenges become extremely more difficult as land gets kind of hypervalued in these markets. There's a chance that the business ecosystem in these communities will really change and will reflect the priorities and consuming practices and service requirements of new landowners and look somewhat different from what a production-oriented ownership regime might look like. When it comes to those seeking to run livestock who don't have capital to acquire land in this market, there's obviously going to be a big emphasis on leasing land and other kind of land sharing strategies. However, our interviews did indicate that ultra wealthy buyers are typically not super interested in leasing. So this kind of represents an emerging challenge in this space. There is an emerging service economy for sure around these properties. Whether or not local residents have access to that service economy, whether it's highly professionalized ranch management, interior decoration, other kinds of property investments, whether or not that's available to local residents remains a question. And then there are some pretty interesting dynamics that are happening with the real estate industry where the industry has had to pivot from being something really organized around a model where banks and federal loan processes help inform not only price, but the whole kind of informatics of real estate transactions. And we're seeing more a move to vertically integrated property companies where data is even more difficult to obtain. And so these transactions, I think, will become even more obscure to the general public in the future. So when it comes to kind of local institutions, which is one of the things our research group is particularly interested in, so your conservation district, your fire department, your PTA, there's some interesting dynamics, a lot of open questions. Empire builders might build big public enterprises, tax-exempt foundations that are contributing philanthropic investment to local causes. This might mean new wealth for stewardship groups. It also might mean fewer volunteers and likely means more turnover issues for those community institutions. There's likely a fair amount of pressure on what we would call the local commons, whether that is public land for hunting access or other things. Clearly you see surfacing in these comments a strong interest in privacy and protecting property boundaries. And then under the marker public value, what I'm raising for conversation is just the question that we have in Montana, a set of institutions at the state level that are really focused on understanding land to be about agricultural production. But we're shifting to a mode where the ranch is primarily a real estate investment and a personal enterprise, with commodity production often being a secondary, if that, focus. And so one might ask whether or not agricultural subsidies and rebates for property tax are suited to the emerging property regime. And then there's lots of questions, I think, about what kind of public and private value are created through this new property regime. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and just suggest that, like I hope all good research, there's so much more here than we can possibly do. I'm just going to flag a few important directions that we see and give a nod to some of the excellent work that's happening in other places. Our tiny bit of consolidating parcel records to understand who owns what is extremely labor intensive. It's really important. I think it's the most accurate look we have at this, but the challenge of understanding who owns what in America when it comes to land is going to exceed the capacity of little research groups like ours. And fortunately, there's some people working in the artificial intelligence and big data space who are really trying to look at how they can use cadastral and tax roll data to get beyond the existing data barriers. And so once you do that, you can ask all sorts of interesting questions about where ownership pattern intersects with other ecosystem services and even other property regimes in nature, whether it's who owns what water, all sorts of other questions. There is a contemporary discussion in Montana about public value and fiscal policy. And I know there's been a lot of interest, as there often is, in kind of conservation easements in this space. So we think these data are important to that conversation. There's a really important set of questions. The one that most interests me is this question about kind of how local institutions and local economies can take this capital coming into this region and pivot in as active a way as possible. So some of you know that I'm trying as hard as I can to get out from underneath the pandemic to be on sabbatical next year. And what I'm planning to focus on in that sabbatical is looking at how in other countries that have what we call this hypervaluation frontier, how community institutions are approaching the consolidation of ownership under super high wealth individuals, and what kind of unique opportunities there are in that space to rethink land ownership and its relationship to local economies. And then those of you who know Katie Epstein know that she is really a leader in the political ecology side of this, and with colleagues like our colleagues at PERC who have really been looking at the wildlife management side of this. There's all sorts of important questions that come out of that. So I've raced through a lot, talking a mile a minute. I apologize for that. What I'd like to do now is recognize our many contributors and supporters to this work, say that I'm hoping we can have a good conversation about this. So I will stop sharing my screen and put us on gallery view and invite questions and contributions.
Thanks so much, Julia, for such a fascinating presentation. I'd like to encourage the audience to bring your questions to our attention now. To ask questions, you can unmute yourself, use the raise hand function, or put your question in the chat.
So I'll just start with a couple that are in here. Rob, thank you. Rob Marr asks, is the number of owners decreasing? And yes, we're talking about sort of small numbers, but in general, we have a fixed kind of inventory of large holdings. And so as they get bigger, we get smaller numbers of them. Oh, there's a million questions here. Okay, so Andy Ron is, I think, on the line. Hopefully we can get him to stick around. Andy is really the expert in this. And if you don't know, he has a great podcast, Ranch Investor Podcast. He is a really important collaborator in this. He got so busy, I think, in the pandemic panic that we've kind of lost touch a little bit, but he's been a really generous contributor and is a longtime GIS expert in the region, and offers a link here to montanalandsource.com, which is I highly recommend as a resource on this. Okay, I'm just going to keep going through the questions here. Reed asks about research on the use of PRF insurance policies by wealthy ag land buyers as an investment strategy and hedge against drought. The payouts in the West have been very lucrative. Typical policy premium is affordable to very profitable businesses. Short answer, no, I'm not an expert on this. I'm going to just pivot to an important talking point, which is like this work is in dialogue with a lot of the research done by economic geographers and economic sociologists to understand the whole role of sort of financializing agricultural land. And one of the things I think makes ranch property pretty different is that it does have this highly emotional component where syndicates might get together and invest in real estate investment trusts and take an investment profit off of those yearly from their trees. They tend to have a different set of meanings than do these high net worth properties. Okay, one last question and I'm just like racing through these to probably have some discussion. Ashley, thinking of consequences of turnover, are there plans or interest in researching what's happening with water rights associated with these properties? Yes, Ashley, you should stay here and do a PhD about this. And the reason I say that is that early on, Mike Clark, the really amazing supporter of all of this work, was when we were doing this original work was in transition in his careers and ended up at Trout Unlimited. And we did some early work linking seniority of water rights from the water right databases to property ownership. And again, it's kind of like a big data mess that far exceeds my skills and capacity. But I think that that's a really important question. So, you know, in terms of who controls what, controlling water rights is super important. So that's a great question, Ashley. That exhausts the chat. Who would like to take themselves off, put their video on and talk? Hi, Neva.
Hi, Julia. Thank you. That's fantastic. And as somebody who spends a lot of time talking to people in rural communities and just spent like a week on a friend's ranch out in the Bull Mountains, which should be included in your map because some of those same people own up there. But anyway, I just want to say how valuable what you have done is, because, and especially in your, pointing out the lack of transparency in the realty industry and in the information regarding ownership. This is a really major problem on the ground, and I think it's one that people have not paid sufficient attention to politically in terms of trying to get some of these things changed. Have you worked at all in the policy arena to make suggestions regarding the data availability, and why is that something that should be available in your opinion?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the short answer is that no, I think it's a little safer for me to be invited into that arena. This is like the third rail, right? I think even just we're in a really reactive moment politically. And so anything that challenges sort of norms around property are really tricky. But I will say, Neva, that I mentioned the Fiscal Modernization Committee, that there is a sense that our property tax regime is really out of step with what's happened to our economy. So I think that's an entry point for some of these conversations. And then I might, I don't know, I can't tell who's where, but Andy, if you're like listening and around, Andy is really familiar with the pushes that come every legislative session to open back up this property data. And he's really been an advocate of making it available. So Andy, do you want to respond to that question about like, why should this be available and what's happening in that space?
Yeah, sure. I think just about every legislative session, although I'm not sure about the last one, some form of disclosure is proposed. I think the Department of Revenue actually is sometimes behind it. It would make their job immensely easier. One of the big resistances actually is the Realtors Association. They usually claim they're protecting the privacy of their client base, but I think they're really protecting their own, private data, because MLS is their own private data that they're able to utilize, and you need realtors to access that data. So it really undermines their place in the market, I guess, or it just provides them a strong professional advantage. I will say I have noticed a shift over the years in the rural land market. When I got started 20 years ago, I think most people that you talk to, ranch brokers and appraisers, even though non-disclosure is a real big pain for everybody involved, most people were really behind it. It was just kind of that Montana individualistic government out of our business kind of thing. But I really think technology change and whatnot, everybody is so used to getting so much information online easily and instantly. It's interesting talking to new professionals, younger people coming into the appraisal world, coming into the real estate world. They think it's crazy. They get started and they're just like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever heard of. So I think there's a generational and technological change and I've even some old time appraisers and old time brokers that I've heard rail against it years ago, I hear now saying, maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea.
Thank you.
Kathy, hi. Oh, you're muted. I still can't hear Kathy, can it? That's me. That shows it is muted, and then that should be unmuted, but I still can't hear you. I don't know. Sorry. You can call me. You can put it in the chat. I want to just note that Hannah Gosnell, who's on the phone, is really, also more knowledgeable than me about all of this stuff, is really doing, I want to point out some exciting work. You heard her talk earlier in the term about regenerative agriculture. She really owned the portion of this project to ask how this high net worth clientele is engaging with the regenerative agriculture movement, and not only its land use implications, but also its kind of social implications. So we're really excited for that work that's coming out. And she points to a foundational article about water use that came out of the earlier work.
Who is it, Julia? I didn't catch the name.
You're our old friend Hannah. It's in the chat. Hannah Gosnell, Oregon State University professor. Other questions? Oh, Kathy says, so just actually, Kathy, you were intuiting this. Private landowners are going to be key to finding climate change solutions. How engaged are current landowners, and how do we help them realize their importance? I'm going to punt this one over to Hannah. Are you willing to turn your, I don't know, you don't have to turn your camera on, but I think you'd be a good person to answer this. Jeez. If not, oh, there she is. Didn't mean to force you onto the Zoom camera, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great talk, Julia. So interesting to see where you've taken all this. Boy, it's just come light years since our first, nascent ideas in the early 2000s. But yeah, the current project, Rangelands 2.0, has a little sub project going on that is focused on the subset of high net worth landowners who identify with regenerative ranching. And so a number of these super wealthy people have gotten really excited about the ways that they can contribute to climate change mitigation by buying up ranches and engaging in climate smart regenerative agriculture. So, not a huge number. I've interviewed about 20 people so far that are in that world, but, they do represent quite a number of acres amongst them. So, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's you could sort of differentiate them from maybe the Rangelands 1.0 amenity buyers that we were looking at, that were mostly interested in trout miles and elk acres. And this newer group is really interested in larger issues of climate change and the potential for soil carbon sequestration. And many of them are women too, which is kind of an unexpected finding. So I'll be working on writing up those results this fall, which is almost this winter. But yeah, hope to get those out soon.
It does seem to have, maybe Hannah, tell me if I'm wrong, but that there is a really emerging network of those owners, Kathy, because I think they have this organizing principle of regenerative agriculture, and they often access it through, networks around that. And so their managers, have access to a network. And that is, I think, potentially quite a distinguishing feature from those owners who are here for their own retreat and not particularly interested in engaging in a larger network. So that what we've learned over the 20 years of doing this work is that the realtor is the single most important point of contact for many of those owners, because once that's the relationship that links them into bigger networks. And so vertical integration in these ranch real estate companies is really important. And so possibly we need in the climate work, really to think about those large companies, the Holland Halls, the Fay Ranches, and think about how they could be enlisted as allies in the climate smart agriculture kind of piece. That would be one suggestion. Okay. I noticed a question coming from Wyatt. Why is Gallatin County not included? And that's just because exactly what you say, Wyatt, we've left it out because even when we started this work, it just showed a really strong effect from both the resort and the metropolitan kind of growth of Bozeman was pretty different from the other counties. And I think early on, you weren't sure we're going to get very good data here. So we could, Carbon County is a little bit similar. There's a lot more noise in the property data there.
Cool, thanks, Julia.
But there's so many great student projects here. I would just say like this technique for homogenizing the records and just looking at patterns of ownership is, we have that all written up and it is accessible to GIS students, and we'd love to see more counties done. Lee Spangler has a great question about trends regarding access to islanded public lands. I don't think I have anything more to say about that, Lee, than what you see in the paper, which is that, I think the main takeaway is like, this is a really idiosyncratic group of people, and they bring to their ownership lots of different values. An explicit interest in public access is far less common in this group of owners. Although there are, projects like APR, which are purchasing private land and making it more accessible than it has been in the past. So it varies. But I think that islanded question, the gate locking, all that is a whole set of interesting political questions waiting for students to go out and study them. And Kathy, I see your point. We're not just talking about regen, but also, all those other things. Any other questions, comments?
This is Adam Sigler. I was building on Lee's question, so I think you probably have already addressed it, but just thinking about the exclusion of leases, and I think about block management for hunters and those land access opportunities, and it's easy to understand, I guess, why people want to exclude based on what you've said, but notable exceptions or opportunities that to try and maintain public access. And I mean, you mentioned APR. I don't know if there's any other notable examples.
Might have reached that point where like the adrenaline has eclipsed my ability to think well about this. We are very interested in this. In my own previous work, done a lot of work on access. And certainly there are organizations that are really working on this, One Montana being a prominent one, that are really trying to kind of think about ways. I guess I see some of the models that have attempted to bring together owners to create unique kind of access within the larger, when we're just talking about hunting, for example. Some of those really early experiments are kind of falling apart in the context of ownership change. So I do think it's a tricky one, Adam, and the state, of course, is in the middle of an elk management plan. And Fish, Wildlife and Parks has done some interesting mapping around access. So again, another like really fun and interesting kind of data set in that space.
Thank you. Fascinating talk, by the way. That was awesome.
Julia, we have a question from Elise asking, can you provide some thoughts on the trends of investment groups versus individuals also investing in land in Montana for real estate development, agricultural land, and conservation properties?
Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit, and again, like I would say Andy's podcast is a good one to go to. In general, what we've heard from our real estate professionals, we don't see a huge pressure from what we would call the syndicates, other than projects like APR. And so that financialization of land that you see in agricultural land, that's not these high net worth ranches, is less visible here. There are some interesting syndicates that exist, and they tend to be about a conservation value or a land management approach, not the real estate investment trust kind of model. So if that's what you're asking, I think that's the point to take away there. And one final question to squeeze in. I'm happy to hang around, but we'll let people go at one who have to go.
Julia, thanks for the great talk. And thank you for the reference to your 2006 article on the implications for conservation. Would you like to briefly comment on what you see as implications for conservation?
I think the biggest takeaway, James, is just the idea that ownership change doesn't necessarily mean fragmentation. And so there are places where fragmentation is a very real pressure, And parcelization is a huge issue. And what we're really seeing now is build out of parcelization that happened in the 90s. So that's an issue. Then there's this other whole set of things associated with ownership change where it's not the developer who is really, enacting large scale change. It is these private individuals. And in that sense, it's wildly mixed. We've written about, the relationship between these property management dynamics and elk and wildlife management. And again, mixed. I think these tend to be very wildlife tolerant landscapes, which is in general for wildlife a good thing, but it really does change their role in the kind of human ecological system. And, so the sort of phenomenon of resident elk and the related potential, relationships with disease is something that maybe, it's really hard to quantitatively study this related to these changes in ownership. And yeah, lots more questions, I think, James, to ask and continue to answer. I would point to Kate Epstein's brilliant paper, which I think she would be willing to share, where she looks at the conflicts that have emerged for wildlife managers and the whole new sets of skills that they've had to develop. She writes from an affective ecology standpoint. It's just really beautiful work based on her work interviewing wildlife managers about relating to this class of owners. So lots of good stuff there.
Great, thanks so much.
Sure thing. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so if you have somewhere better to go, please go, but I'm happy to chat if others want to keep talking, because this is obviously a big passion project for a long time. Thank you so much for coming. It's just great. And please do follow up with myself and all my co-authors, because we've got so much more work here than we could possibly share in this brief amount of time.
Thank you so much. I do have one other question, if you have a sec.
Sure.
Or more a comment. Because I really like, in just observing this conversation and the comments in the chats and stuff, it's really an interesting tension, perhaps, between, building healthy rural economies, which you were talking about, and this notion of, well, if actually the land is owned by fewer people, concentration could be good for conservation from one perspective, right? And that makes it a really tricky problem to solve, because if you're prepping for Amazon in Roundup, and how do you I don't know. I just think, like, how do you interpret this notion of somebody coming in and buying up a lot of the land? And I don't know. It really neglects the rural people if we just go to knee jerk, I guess, in a way, to this notion of large landowners are going to do better conservation. I'm glad to hear there's regenerative, a lot of people involved in regenerative agriculture. I know that's true in Yellowstone County. Guy owns from the Yellowstone up to the Bull Mountains, all the way. So huge that there is a great potential, but it's really, does it benefit the rural communities, and how? Or does it make people cowboys into, butlers? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Neva, you'll be like completely sensitive to the idea that it's complicated. And the best thing that this work does is start those conversations, because regardless of, this has accelerated to this like kind of wild level here, but, wealthy outside owners have been a feature and fabric of this landscape for a long time. And, livestock-based commodity production has been wildly marginal also for a long time, and not necessarily creating, people love the lifestyle and they like some of the cultural attributes, but doesn't necessarily create a lot of economic security, especially if you're not, an freeholder with no debt. So we're doing a lot of work in central Montana, Katie and I, and really interested in the way that when these dynamics start to take off, I think they prompt like kind of an equal and opposite reaction, where people are willing to rethink some of their conventions. And maybe do things like grass banking. I think if you could track it, you'd see more arm's length transactions occurring, where people who are interested in protecting their, not only their relatives, but also their, sort of working landscapes are, operating outside that market. And I think those kinds of dynamics are super interesting. But yes, I think that the notion that there's limited access for rural neighbors to the capital that's circulating on these places is very important. And I guess my sense is that some of the larger conservation groups take this really seriously. And so again, Nature Conservancy in central Montana has this, wildly successful grass bank, and World Wildlife Fund has really focused on funding and supporting community development by small, rangeland producer groups who are working on, any number of things. So, I mean, it's happening. And maybe the best thing we can do is sort of talk about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and like how that impacts those rural communities too, because otherwise, if you don't talk about it, then there's just pushback, like we've seen, like around APR or whatever. And then the other question I would be interested in is like, how are those folks, like the conservation landowners, different from or similar to the large landowners that you're describing, who are mostly private individuals buying up these ranches, right? Or families.
Yeah, I mean, one point I would just add in there is this idea that these places can be sites of experimentation. And so we're familiar with them as sites of experimentation for conservation projects, Turner's Ranch being a place that the wolves could go. I think Hannah's work is going to be really interesting to see how much the regen crowd, forgive me for using that term, is willing to experiment economically. And we see some signs that they are really interested in that. And so could this be a test bed for things like these land exchanges that have really taken off in, our more humid areas like California and New England, where sort of young agrarians are coming onto properties without being owners, because people are seeking to expand the benefit of what they're doing. So that seems exciting. And then maybe you could take that same analysis to the difference between the big conservation buyers and others. And one thing I think, just to go back to the point at the beginning, is like, which is a group of people who's really willing to take on relationships with Native people and Native land issues in a compelling way. And so you have to give some credit to these large conservation groups that are able to use private property to advance the priorities of Native people who've been dispossessed. And there I'm talking not just about bison, but some of the land access issues we have happening in the crazies. So it's complicated. And any access we have, but I think your students, Neva, your students who are studying sustainable agriculture are going to go work on these places. They potentially are going to influence these owners. I think it's an exciting time, as discouraging as some of the trends are.
Well, one of the alumni from your ranching program there at MSU is working for this large landowner in Yellowstone County, where I just was recently. So as a ranch, he and his wife or something. So anyway, thanks, Julie. I appreciate you staying on to visit about it. It's fascinating question. I'd love to talk more sometime. Thank you.
Likewise. Okay, take care. Is there anyone else dying to get a word in? So it looks like people are logging off, so I'll say goodbye. Hey, Andy, thanks so much for coming.